All right, Alexander, let's go through the questions from the live stream that we did with Gonzalo the other day, where we talked about the gas for rubles and other topics as well. And let's just jump right into it. I might be repeating some questions that we probably answered during that live stream because we got through pretty much 80% of the questions, but there's like still 20% that are kind of unanswered. So I may repeat some of the questions said, but that's all right. It's okay. So let's just go through the questions one by one, and let's get started. From, let's see, from Kurt, too many people, probably because they are not watching the Duran, are still looking for money to buy a bridge of Alexander's. I think we actually answered that.
I think we did cover that.
The truth from my perspective. Yeah, I think we did cover that. Truth from my perspective said, I wish U.S. citizens weren't so indoctrinated and critically think and ask, why is the North Korea treatment being given to Russia, but the U.S. WMD's crickets? This is greater and goes deeper than we know. I think we answered that as well.
We did answer it.
But it's a good
just
point.
Quickly, it's a very good point. It's a very, very good point. Now, I don't think Russia is anything like North Korea, but trying to isolate Russia is folly. And given that it's a nuclear power, multiple times more powerful than North Korea, I mean, it's an incredibly reckless and dangerous thing to do. And yet some people in the West, in Britain especially, I think, and also in the US, are talking like that.
Yeah, from Terry Hansen, the Polish MOD announced the military action exercises for the month of May involving large amounts of people and equipment in the east and south of Poland. I've heard the east and south, I've heard the north and the north and east, and then I've heard all the country. So do you have any indication where this exercise is going to be taking place?
What I have read is the north and east. Now, north could direct towards Kaliningrad, or it could direct towards Belarus. We don't know. But of course, the point is, you mobilize troops, you concentrate them. That could also be a ruse. The Russians spoke about a Polish incursion into Western Ukraine. And what is really dismaying is that we've seen no strong denials about this from Warsaw. So, what we're getting instead are reports of exercises. But I mean, to give an example, the Moldovan government has been going out of its way over the last few hours to deny that they have any plan to attack Transnistria. Now, they may be telling the truth, they may be lying, but at least they're denying it. Warsaw isn't denying it to anything like the same degree.
Raphael says, I watch Russian TV. The West is making a big mistake. Russia considers they are part of the Western economic system still. Nobody can kick them out.
I think that's true in the sense that they are still part of the Western economic system, and that the Western economies are suffering and suffering badly as a result of this lunatic policy of trying to cut themselves off from their raw materials, their resources, hinterland, and what would have been ultimately one of their big markets. But that's what they're going to do. The Russians have options. I mean, this is the thing Westerners just don't understand at all. Russia is one at the same time a European country and an Asian one, a Eurasian country, if you like. Their longest border is with China. They've also got borders with Japan, and of course with the Koreas. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Herding Cat says, we are in this mess because NATO does not respect social distancing. That's an excellent point, actually.
It is an excellent point. I think that's brilliant. I think that's absolutely brilliant. I think if Lavrov wants to he's sometimes a bit of a tease. If he wants to troll NATO, that's he should borrow that one from you.
Yeah, he should borrow that from Herding Cats. Excellent point. Stephen, Thank you for that super sticker. J.K. Wynn says, with politics downstream from culture, banning Russian culture will only validate the message told to citizens and invigorate the will to fight back in every way.
You're absolutely right, and that's already what it's doing. I mean, I should say it's absolutely insane. I mean, it's not just insane, it's sinister. I mean, situations where, Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, people of this, we don't really want Tolstoy, presumably. We don't want to have anything to do with them anymore. It's just, I mean, this is so ludicrous, given how central, how absolutely crucial Russian culture has been as part, in some ways, of Western culture as well. I mean, we are really denying an absolutely essential part of ourselves. So it's going to be impoverishing with the West. But of course, in terms of Russia, and by the way, there's no moves in Russia to say outlaw Shakespeare or anything like that, or not teach Shakespeare. But in terms of Russia, what it's done, and I'm getting so many Russians now that I know coming back and telling me this, it says it's confirmed to them our fundamental entrenched hostility to them, which of course Russians are now connecting to earlier events in their history, the German invasions of 1914 and 41, the Napoleonic invasion of 1812, the Crimean War, all of that.
Yeah. Raphael says, I will say it again. There is no effing way Biden will go to Poland. And if Russia did not say okay, Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense in Kiev without Russia's green light.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Biden, of course, hasn't gone even to Ukraine. I mean, it was basically ruled out. They wouldn't let him go to Ukraine, given how, frankly, decrepit he looks. I mean, his latest address, which we're going to do a video about, was just, I mean, it was just, it's already been ridiculed and parodied. But you don't want to send him to Kiev. But I mean, you don't want to send him to Warsaw. I mean, when he was in Warsaw, his speech there was a disaster. So you don't want to send him personally there. The big question is not whether Biden himself goes, but if the Poles do move into Western Ukraine and the Russians strike at them, which is what Putin essentially is saying they will do, what will the US do in that case? Now, maybe there's been discussions about this between the Russians and the Poles and the Russians and the Americans behind the scenes. I don't think so, actually. I think that Putin gave a very clear warning. He said, if the Western troops, NATO troops, enter Ukraine, they will face lightning strikes. And I think we should take him seriously. I don't think there's been any agreement at all.
Jahangir says, based on history, Russia has more emotional and real support outside the collective West. If collective West players want markets, the players will have to change their thinking and sycophancy.
I understand that, and I think that's probably true. I mean, the president of Indonesia, for example, has now made it very clear that he's inviting Putin to the G20 summit. I mean, that's one example. And Indonesia is a country with a long history, and of course it's always carefully balanced. Well, it carefully balances its position between the great powers now. It's no longer an unequivocal ally of the US. And if you see across the world, I think there's actually a lot of sympathy and understanding for Russia in India, in China especially, in Latin America and Africa, all sorts of places. Now, I don't think the West is understanding that. I don't think they want to listen to it. I think at the moment they're just remorselessly moving forward because they talk amongst themselves. They believe that they are the only people who ultimately matter. They don't care what people are saying in Jakarta or Buenos Aires or Kinshasa or wherever. But of course, eventually it might catch up on them. I mean, the days when everything was decided in a few Western capitals are gone. But I don't think people in Europe especially really understand that. And I'm afraid the old man in the White House is living in a world of his own, which bears no relation to any world that ever existed, but at least has perhaps some connection to the world of 50 years ago rather than today.
Matlis says, I wonder what mental gymnastics NATO and the West will use about invading sovereign nations if Poland grabs the Lviv area on one hand, but then Hungary grabs a small portion of the West soon afterwards.
Well, that's a very good question, and I wonder how they will react. I think they will find ways. They will always come up with, as you put it, some verbal and mental gymnastics. They'll say that these troops, at least the Polish troops, are there to save the Ukrainians from the Russian horde that's sweeping westwards. I fully expect, by the way, that we're going to hear lots of blood-curdling stuff about Chechens and Cossacks, the usual ghastly stereotyping and, frankly, appalling language about these people. but we're going to hear an awful lot about that too, and how the Poles, as bearers of European and Western civilization, funny how that comes back into fashion when it relates to Russia. They're coming in to defend these heroic people in Western Ukraine. What Western Ukrainians think about it, of course, will be another matter. And of course, about Hungary, it will be a completely different story, because Hungary will be seen as being involved in some kind of cynical partition of Ukraine with Russia. They will come up with something. They always do.
Yeah,
And
they always do.
unfortunately, people listen to them. That's the trouble.
Leon, thank you for that super sticker. Johan says this donation is for Alexander to get wallpaper in his office. Thank you for that. Johan, Jane says, Alex, just a couple of pounds to go towards your date with my car mechanic. Thank you, Jane, for that. All is well with my car. J.K. Wynn says, from 1-6, 2 truckers, 2 Russia people cheering the taking of property and denial of legal representation don't realize the precedents that will come back around.
Absolutely, you're completely correct. I mean, Alex, I think, put it very well. And, Gonzalo earlier, the fact is, this hasn't come out of nowhere. They've been edging towards this for years. I mean, this is the biggest event of this so far by miles. Seizing yachts, bank accounts, all without any form of due process at all. It is completely unconstitutional. It is completely illegal. The people it's being done to are being denied legal representation. But it is just a far bigger version of what was done to the truckers in Canada, what's going to happen to all sorts of people in all sorts of countries all across the collective West. Due process in the West is collapsing. And, as somebody who was heavily invested personally in all of that, I was, a court official for many years. I just have to say, I'm deeply shocked about it and very, very concerned that the legal professions in Western countries are too terrified to speak out against it. They're now becoming very intimidated. British lawyers who've acted for Russian businessmen, as I've said, have been threatened with sanctions if they continue to do so. These are appalling things, and nothing is happening. And of course, it's a further precedent which will lead on to ever worse things. Just before we finish on this, back in the 1950s, in 1956, of course, the Russians had gold reserves in New York and in London. This is the time of the crushing of the Hungarian uprising. The Soviets considered transferring their gold reserves from New York to London because they were afraid the US would seize them. In those far-off days, President Eisenhower was in the White House. The United States understood the importance of sovereign immunity and protection of private property, and the US did no such thing, and that was in the Cold War.
From Eurogabor, Orban wrote to Schultz pointing out the importance of strategic cooperation between the two countries. Do you think Schultz has enough balls and brain to veto an oil sanctions? More tomato for Macron.
No, he does not. What Schultz always does, this has been the consistent pattern now for months. He comes out, he says, no, I'm not going to do this. This is going to be really bad. I don't want to cut off Russian banks from SWIFT. I don't want to impose, I don't want to send arms to Ukraine. I don't want oil sanctions. And then he eventually always capitulates to the hardliners, to the Greens, to, Baerbock and Habeck in the government, to Macron in France, to Biden and Johnson and all of these things. And he ends up doing, with disastrous consequences, the very same things that he said he wouldn't do. He is going to fold on oil sanctions. It is inevitable. It's just a question of time. And it's also a question of what form.
Yeah. Freik Hadkat says, hi guys, love the analysis. Being Greeks, what do you think of Yanis Varoufakis and his political project Mera 25?
I don't think it's going to succeed. I think Varoufakis is an extremely clever man. I think he was a very, very disastrous finance minister. I think his handling the diplomacy with the European Union was utterly wrong. And I also think he was taken for a ride by Syriza and its ludicrous prime minister, whose name I'm shudder even to remember, quite frankly. So I think he's a clever man. I think he's an academic. I think he's overconfident in his own intelligence, as academics and clever academics often are. I think he comes up with all sorts of political projects. I'm afraid they will fail. That doesn't mean that I don't often listen to what Varoufakis says. I think very often his economic analyses, as an economist, are good ones, but his political projects aren't going to go anywhere.
Yeah. Ivan says, Gonzalo tiene un gato de los pantalones. Thank you, Ivan, for that. Ago says, at what point will Ukrainians realize they are being sacrificed in a proxy war, and at what point will they rebel against their puppet president?
It's a very good question. I don't know. But sooner or later, they will come to that realization. Look at the Chechens. Look at the Chechens. They were used by the West in exactly that way in the 90s and early 2000s. Do you remember how, people were talking about how the Chechens would hate Russians forever, that they'd be fighting the Russians forever, how they were encouraged and incited and persuaded to get involved in all kinds of terrible battles with the Russians? Today, they are the angriest people against the West, and they're at the vanguard of the fighting with the Russian army in Ukraine. I'm sure the same will happen with Ukrainians as well. When they realize that they're being used, the bitterness and anger is going to be beyond anything the West has seen up to now.
Yeah. Tupac, thank you for your super sticker. Jane, thank you for your super sticker. Celeste says, is the UK deploying SAS troops to Ukraine to rescue big fish under the bunker of Mariupol?
No, even though the commander at Mariupol, at the Azovstal Steelworks, made an extraordinary video in which he called for a Dunkirk-style evacuation of himself, his troops, and the civilians there from Azovstal, something which shows, to my mind, how completely out of touch with reality he is. But there's nothing like that going to happen at Azovstal. I mean, the SAS is not big enough to do it. There are not enough of them to do it. They're dispersed all over the world. I've heard that they're involved. They are in Ukraine, but they could not do that kind of thing. What they might do, if things become dangerous, is they might help people like Zelensky, for example, to leave Ukraine. But they cannot evacuate thousands of people from the Azovstal factory. It is inconceivable.
All right. Vexilo says, guys, check out Stan from A Russian Opinion on YouTube. We will do that. Thank you for your super chat. Arthur says, hello, everybody. Glad to see you back, Gonzalo. Thank you, Arthur, for that. Iris says, I think NATO will not attack after Putin's lightning fast warning. Love to have Gonzalo in your show.
Well, we'll see. I'm afraid I agree with you in terms of the fact that I'm sure the Pentagon is absolutely horrified at any such idea. But there are some very, very strange people around. I mean, we have Liz Truss making speeches about Russia being driven out of Crimea and Donbass. We have Jaroslaw Kaczynski in Poland, who, as I said, has all kinds of complexes about Russia. We have other people who talk in extraordinary ways. So I hope the saner councils will prevail. I'm far from confident that they will.
Kurt says, once Russia has full control of Ukraine, I find it likely that Russia will give small, hostile border-sharing countries an offer that they cannot refuse.
It may come to that. It's not inconceivable. Some Russians have spoken as if that's possible. Patrushev, Putin's national security advisor, has spoken sometimes in those kind of terms. But, that's some way off. They've got to take over the whole of Ukraine, and they haven't done that yet. So let's see what happens.
Chris T says, talking of decades, climate change will unfreeze most of Russia's mineral resources, and the sea rise will not affect them. Watch this space, given Russia and the U.S.'s geography.
I'm not going to discuss the climate change issues, which I'm not qualified to do. But what I will say is this. What this whole affair over the last few weeks has demonstrated is already the pivotal importance of Russia as a commodities producer. And that's going to remain, and that's going to grow. And of course, they're going to become, they're increasingly strong as a manufacturing and high technology power. And things are going to change, and they're going to change in ways that Westerners don't expect, and are miscalculating, and are miscalculating very, very badly. So yes, I may not, I'm not going to discuss climate change, but about your overall assessment, I am in full agreement.
Yeah, Eyes Wide Shut says, look up the documentary Ukraine on Fire.
Yeah.
Red Pill Scholar says, as far as the consequences against anyone who dares legal represent Russians, I ask, is there any morality whatever left in Europe and the US anymore?
No, I mean, I have to say, for me, that is a red line. That was something that, I never expected to see. I just say, once upon a time, long ago, my job, one of my jobs, was to go into the cells under the Royal Courts of Justice, find some of the most terrible people I have ever met, and arrange for them to get legal representation. So I've seen some people. I'm not going to discuss what they did and who they were, but I've seen some people who, I wouldn't want to go close to. But I felt it was my duty to arrange for them to be represented. It wasn't my job to represent them myself, but I would spend hours on the phone talking to lawyers, persuading them, and wanted by the court to do it, to get these people represented. And I invariably succeeded. And, sometimes I had to twist arms, but that was the tradition in Britain. Everybody got representation. So I feel personally, deeply shocked and betrayed by this.
John Hawkins, thank you for that super sticker. Everett Clayson says, thanks for the information, guys. Stay safe. Jungle Jin says, Rump Ukraine may well become Europe's problem, but must still be subject to being denazified, which speaks of an inspection regime. Is this feasible?
Yeah, I think so. But I think that when they talk about that, when the Russians talk about that, what ultimately can only happen with some sort of regime change in Kiev. I don't think the Russians would hoped that I think they were hoping that it wouldn't have to come to that they'd be able to deal with Zelensky and his people and find a way out. But I think with every single passing day, I think that they understand that there is really no option.
Smug Buddha says, NATO establishing a buffer zone like in Syria, Turkey, using Moldova false flag, spanning Odessa to Lviv. Is this desirable for all or none?
No, it is not desirable. It is an inherently unstable and extremely dangerous situation. The Russians would press on it all the time, and it would spread violence and armed men and young armed men and women, no doubt too, with all kinds of dangerous beliefs and lots of weapons all over Europe. It is a catastrophically bad idea. It is one that it is astonishing that we're even thinking about.
Rob says, thank you, gentlemen. How worried are we that bio and or nuclear weapons will find an excuse to appear in this conflict?
Well, I think we should certainly be worried, because the very fact that people are even talking about these possibilities, which we should never be talking about these possibilities, is in itself horrifying. When it comes to nuclear weapons, I still don't think it's going to happen. And I don't see why the Russians would want to do it, given that, frankly, they're winning. Why would they even want to go down there? I'm sure that's not part of their plans, and they've denied it. But if you look at the Western media, they're full of these stories, and I find it extremely disturbing. And of course, in the media in the West doesn't want to talk about bioweapons, but we know that there have been projects of various kinds and discussions and ideas about these things, and I'm worried about that too. Mm-hmm.
Kurt says the true alternatives are SHIT, but also never underestimate the power of British humor. When you see they are still supporting Boris Johnson. Very true.
They're so true.
Mitt, so true. Mitt says the EU must suffer to learn that for the USA, there's only two things that matter: money and power. EU nations are nothing but disposable pets.
I think I basically agree. I think that we shouldn't be overly cynical about the US. The US is a great power. It's got its allies in Europe. It puts pressure on them. It gets them to do what it wants. That's what all great powers do. Let's not be idealistic about this. This is what all great powers do. The people who I find contemptible in this situation are the Europeans themselves. I mean, the European elites have accepted, not with reluctance, but with enthusiasm, this subordinate position for themselves. It is a betrayal of Europe, of European civilization, and of the people of Europe as well. And it's a sickness that I have to say I find very, very disturbing. And I wonder how it can be cured and what will be left of Europe before it is.
Ron says, all of this madness has occurred due to massive voter and election fraud in 2020, which succeeded in installing a vegetable in the White House who is controlled by warmongering neocons.
I agree, but we've got to be very careful still discussing those sort of topics. I agree, actually. I mean,
Ralph says,
I'm not going to say more, actually.
Elections have consequences. Ralph says, I believe Putin is justified in a limited defense of Russian people against Western aggression, but afraid a propaganda of lies once again will underpin great senseless destruction of life. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, I agree with that, yeah.
I agree with that. Darren says, to be angry with the right person to the right degree at the right time for the right purpose and in the right way. That is not within everybody's power and is not easy. Aristotle. We actually answered that, but it's still a good quote.
It is a very good quote. I would also add, by the way, that it is the duty of a statesman. I mean, statesmen and women need to understand that. Otherwise, they're not qualified to exercise power. Decisions made in anger are repented at leisure. Caesar Augustus, who no doubt read his Aristotle, used to say that before he made a decision, when he was angry, he used to stop and recite the Greek alphabet. Interestingly, it was the Greek alphabet, but he used to mentally think through the Greek alphabet, then pause, then think, then decide.
Raphael says, Germany will end the war and make peace.
I don't know. The Germans, I've come to the view, actually, that there is something compulsive about this. There were two great world wars, both of which the Germans declared war on Russia. In both cases, and I could say this certainly about the Second World War, that I've spoken to many people in Germany, there was a huge amount of enthusiasm on the part of many people, not everybody, but many people. The higher up the social scale you went, the idea that you were fighting Russia was almost a sense of relief. Every time it ends in disaster, every time the Germans say to themselves, we're not doing that again. And now here we are, and they're doing it not perhaps in quite the same way, but they're doing it to themselves again. There is something very compulsive about this, and I wonder whether it will ever change. I've never said that before. I like Germany, but I do wonder at the end of the day, after the events of the last few weeks, whether any genuine, deep rapprochement between Germans and Russians is ever possible.
Yeah, Van 1976, thank you for your super sticker. Fox Drake says, thanks, Alexander. Please do watch it. Perhaps you can get Mike Malone on the show. His site is Gold Silver. We'll check out.
Yeah, we'll certainly check
Silver.
it out.
Yeah, we'll check it out. Omega Blade said, I've been sharing your videos with coworkers to help influence the court of public opinion here in America. Thanks for everything you do. Thank you very much for that, Omega Blade. Sticky Mark says, Alex C., I love your walk and talks. Housebound. Thank you very much, Sticky Marks, for that. Radovid says, Napoleon said, never disturb your enemy when he is making a mistake. Is there anything to add to that?
No. In terms of strategy, it's one of the best things Napoleon said. Napoleon didn't always follow his own advice, it must be said. He did march on Moscow, after all.
That is true. Let's see. Where are we? Bauke says, more interesting would be if Russia is going to assert itself internationally in the military sense, like it did in the 70s in Africa, maybe even in a role as China's shock troops.
Yes, I think we discussed this during the live stream itself.
Yeah,
I'm just going to repeat again briefly what I said over the course of the live stream. I have met many people in Russia who feel that Russia, the Soviet Union, became overextended in the 1970s by doing that. And I think that though they will want to play a role in international affairs, they will be careful this time, or at least they're saying to themselves that they will be careful this time, not to get into that kind of position.
Yeah. Otnosen says Romania's role looks simpler than Poland's. They have to secure Moldova, Transnistria for NATO. The delimitations of spheres happens as we speak.
Well, we'll see what happens. My own sense is, by the way, that there are people in Moldova, even in the pro-Western government there, that are not keen on this. And I'll tell you why. I think it's difficult to figure out why. Because, of course, from their point of view, if Moldova is absorbed by Romania, they're no longer top dog. I mean, people like Sandu, I mean, she's no longer going to be president of Moldova. And it's difficult to see why she would ever become president of Romania. So, and I get the sense, by the way, most people in Moldova would not want to be absorbed by Romania in that kind of way. So, let's wait and see. But certainly this is a very dangerous situation. And spheres of influence and balance of power and all that is all very well, but these kind of things have a way of getting out of control.
Yeah, let's see. Headhunter says, Gonzo, I'm in Montreal. True, except for the curfew. Can't get out of the country because I'm not jabbed. Don't know what to do. People are sheep here.
Yeah. I'm not
Thank you,
going to add
Headhunter, for
anything.
that super chat. Yeah. Let's see. Where are we here? Francisco, thank you for that super chat. Tatiana, thank you for that super chat. Simo says, do you believe the food crisis or shortages are being intentionally engineered?
No, I don't think that they're being intentionally engineered, but I do think some people might try. In fact, it's inevitable. Some people are going to try and manipulate them. Now, can I just say, this is a topic that comes up repeatedly, that the WEF, those sort of people, want to create chaos. And I always say this, I think that to some extent there are people who do think like that, and they do facilitate these events. And I also say this, that these people are fools, and what they're doing by engendering chaos is they are preparing the grounds for their own destruction. Because nobody can control chaos, certainly not master manipulators, as they perhaps imagine.
Karen Glass, thank you for that super sticker. Carlos says, keep up the good work, guys. Did the UK give Zelensky's family British citizenship?
It's all over the internet that they have done. I don't know. I mean, this isn't something that's anybody has shared with me. I wouldn't be surprised. Right at the start of the war, Boris Johnson basically said that, if Ukraine needs to set up a government in exile, London is a place they could do it. So why not?
Why not? Byronicus says, do you think that the globalists actually realize that if any nuclear missiles fly, they will all be dead too? And are you getting Scott Ritter back?
Hopefully we will indeed get Scott Ritter back, and we've got other people who are, lining up, and we've got to discuss that. But do please remember, we are two guys. We're very overworked people. We do things as quickly and as effectively as we can do. That's all I'm going to say about this. Now, secondly, in relation to globalists understanding that nuclear war would be a disaster for them, some of them do. Some of them are so completely intoxicated by their own genius and their own arrogance that I don't think they understand it at all. And I don't think they understand the incredible dangers and risks that they are taking. I mean, these are very reckless people. I mean, seizing $300 billion of assets of a nuclear power, not just a nuclear power, but the world's biggest nuclear power. Russia has a bigger nuclear arsenal than the US does. Was an extraordinary thing to do, but they did it. So who's to say that they have as much sense of reality, and indeed sense of self-preservation, as your question implies. We'll see.
Ten Wow says, what do you make of the latest news that Poland wants to invade Ukraine now, establish a peacekeeping force, and keep that part of the country annexation?
I think it is entirely plausible. I think it is highly likely. I think that there are people in Poland who hanker to do this thing. I think there are people in the Polish government who hanker to do this thing. I think most Poles, if it came to it, and if there was a war, would not want it. But, at the moment, the government quite plausibly could do it. and it might think that if it does it, it will get the support of the West. So this is a very dangerous moment.
Bab says, need please an analysis of the Polish leadership. Who are they? Their history. Best regards.
Very good question, and we do need to do it. I mean, it's sort of groundswell of opinion that exists within Poland. I mean, the current government in Poland is it's a nationalist government, which in some ways pursues welfare and economic policies and social policies, which I would support, basically. Um, so, I mean, in its domestic policies, there's a lot that it does, which I'm actually pretty supportive of. But it has a connection to the ideological ideas that go back to the achievement of Polish independence in the 1920s. And this is a big topic. I don't want to revisit it. It talks about, setting, it was the so-called Promethean policy, as it was called then. You weaken Russia, break it up, create a succession of, weak Slavic states. Poland dominates them, and it rebuilds essentially the Rzeczpospolita. It's a romantic, it's foolish. It led Poland to disaster in the 30s. It's doing the same again this time. But clearly there are still people in Poland who think in that way.
Ronald B. says, funny, the Poles seem to be doing to Ukraine what Russia and Germany did to Poland in 1939.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's talk about partitions, these ideas of seizing Lviv. I mean, again, it shows how blind some people are to the implications of their own actions.
Yeah, let's see. This is for Gonzalo, but maybe he's watching this video. Do you advise to discontinue CRP subscriptions on Patreon, given logins have been taken over? Incredibly happy to see you back, and can't believe how much we worried about you. So maybe Gonzalo is seeing that, and he'll be able to answer that question. Let's see. From Gurney, the verbiage confirms they know Russia will annex referendum the territories they hold.
I agree with this. I mean, I think the situation now is becoming increasingly clear. I think that Ukraine made a disastrous mistake after the Istanbul meeting when it retracted all the concessions that it made. I think the Russians are now moving purposefully towards the independence for Kherson region and ultimately Zaporozhye. The ruble is being introduced there. The Russian flag is being introduced there. It seems the last Ukrainian troops in Kherson have now been, the region, have now been pushed out. And, I think it's only a question of time before we see some kind of a referendum taking place there. So, this is where it's going. I mean, what I will say is, Alex, listen to his updates. If you listen to the various things we've been saying on the Duran, this has been, the risk of that from a Ukrainian point of view has been there all the time. And it won't be, it will start at Kherson region, perhaps Zaporozhye, Kharkiv region, there's more advances going on there, Sumy also apparently. Sooner or later, Ukraine is going to lose it all.
Yeah. Let's see. At the Duran spotted an article on Intel Slava, Poland to annex the West Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we've discussed this now. I mean, I think it's a foolish policy. It's the kind of policy that Poland might make. I don't see any sign of a deal between Russia and Poland. And I can see, on the contrary, huge risks for Poland in this. I mean, whatever it was, whatever Western Ukraine was before the Second World War, it's a very, very different place now. And I think Polish troops on the ground, well, they might be welcomed by some people initially, but I can easily see how this could go catastrophically wrong for Poland. And as I like Poland, and I like Polish people, and I have had many Polish friends, I don't want to see this go wrong for Poland at all.
Tuco76 says, speaking of Serbia, justice will only prevail when Kosovo is returned to its rightful owner, Serbia.
I completely agree. By the way, it's interesting.
I think the Euro,
it's interesting that we never talk about Kosovo in connection with the events in Ukraine. An acquaintance of my wife's said, that to his absolute knowledge, the Western powers have never acted to take territory away from another country on the basis of, a national uprising in that particular country. And of course, my wife simply pointed out, well, how do you explain Kosovo? Silence.
Exactly. And a very big, large NATO base there as well.
Absolutely.
Gurney says, I think the euro will lose its status as a major international settlement instrument as Germany industry is destroyed.
I agree with that. I totally agree with that. I think Europe, as I've said already, is heading towards economic marginalization, and Germany is rushing towards deindustrialization. And the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, ought to be standing against it, but he's not.
Ronald B. says, even if the Russians would take direct ruble payments, how would the European countries get rubles except for Gazprom? The sanctions cut off other commercial transactions.
They can't do it because they've cut themselves off from buying rubles. So what they would have to do, what would have to happen is that Gazprom would have to buy the rubles. Gazprom Bank would have to buy the rubles on their behalf. The European Union Commission is trying to say that this violates the sanctions. It doesn't appear as if it does. Now, what happens to all these euros that are then used to buy the rubles, I'm not absolutely sure, but somehow, some way would have to be found of, laundering them through the system in some ways.
Danich says, I'm waiting that Russia will lose its patience and shut Germany off Nord Stream 1.
Not impossible. If Germany, if Uniper and all these companies are prevented from going for gas, for rubles, it's not impossible at all. And then what does Germany do?
Right. Robin Kelly says, is Gerhard Schroeder still the main nexus point for Russian gas to Germany or still connected to Russian energy distribution?
Yes, he's still around. He's still trying to get people to understand that, Germany buying gas from Russia isn't something that Germany is doing as an act of charity. It's an act that Germany did and which he negotiated, which Angela Merkel negotiated, and Helmut Schmidt before him, and Helmut Kohl as well, because it is necessary for Germany and it makes commercial sense for Germany, but nobody's listening. And at the moment, he's finding it very, very difficult to speak out or to get anybody to pay any attention.
Real Lot No Sense says, unless reasonable people take power in the U.S. little by little, the confrontation between Russia, then China, and the West will keep escalating and spread at all levels, and there won't be clear winner, just a world impoverished, exhausted, and radicalized, a truly global suicide.
I think this is entirely a real prospect. It's where the neocons are taking us. And I'm afraid you set it out very well, Real Lot No Sense. I think that eventually things do right themselves. But, these are very dangerous times. And that's, I think that the scenario you've outlined is a realistic one. Mm-hmm.
All right. I think that's everything. 1 second, Alexander. Let me just do one final check for this. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous how Germany tried to pay for gas with Russian stolen money. That is a good point.
Yeah, well,
that is incredible.
It is incredible, absolutely. Yes. I mean, it's so bizarre. It's just, it again shows you the level of adolescent immaturity of the Green ministers. I mean, this is presumably Habeck's idea. I mean, it shows how completely ridiculous these people are and how completely out of their depth they are. Once upon a time, it would have been inconceivable that people like this, who are basically, activists, they're not real politicians in any true sense, would find themselves in that kind of position, or that the German people would ever allow them to remain in that kind of position for very long.
Yeah. Dason System says Trump was surrounded by bad actors, aka VP Pence, and Stephen in Asia says Trump did do many positive things. Without the media's crap, he would have been even more successful.
I agree with both counts. I don't give Trump a completely, perfect score. Absolutely not. He made many mistakes. His appointments were disastrous in many occasions. and he acted often contrary to his own interests. I mean, he should have listened to what Alex was telling him all the time about doing something about social media, and he never did whilst he was president, for example. But I also agree completely that if he'd been treated with the due respect which is owed to the President of the United States, elected according to the Constitution, and had been allowed to pursue his policies without being obstructed and harassed all the time, he could have done a lot of things which would have built on the very real things that he did actually do, which were good for the United States. And, contrast the economic situation then and the economic situation now, and you will see what I mean. Most Americans under Trump saw their living standards improve.
Yeah. All right, let's do like 3-4 more. I see here from Viva Barnes fan, the West is committing the biggest mistake that the Greeks warned us about, hubris.
Yeah, absolutely. And after hubris comes nemesis, as we both, as Greeks, know only very well.
Absolutely. Digar says, Disinformation Governance Board, Senator Josh Hawley is calling to dissolve it.
Yeah, absolutely. He's quite right.
Ministry
I wish
of
people
Truth.
would listen to Ministry of Truth. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Let's do like one more here. And it's a quote from Thomas Sowell. It's amazing how much panic one honest man can spread among a multitude of hypocrites.
So true. That's absolutely right.
Very true. All right. Great. All right. Those are all the questions. Thank you very much to everybody. And Duran Shop. Use the code GOODDAY, 10% off all merch. Take care.